Thank you, Don. I would just like to say I have been a member of this club for over 20 years, and it has been a source of fun, it's been a source of learning, it's been an opportunity for extraordinary community involvement. Yes, it has had some heart-stopping moments over the decades, but it's also provided a time to reflect on some of the most important civic issues facing this community. I am particularly excited about the community convocations, which Don mentioned, which will be working to build a sense of belonging and crossing divides in this community around issues such as racial healing, economic disparity, youth and elders. So I thank you for this opportunity to be at the helm of the organization. But in my capacity as president, I would like my first official duty to be to honor my elder, and that is Don Frisbee, for his extraordinary commitment to the club and to this community, his service and leadership over this last year, particularly for us. And Don, I know you're not done yet because you've pledged to serve on our development committee next year. But on behalf of the entire club, the board, the members, and the staff, I would like to present you. See, they weren't all up here on the podium. There was some hiding. With this small token of our appreciation as a memento of your service to the club. It is, trying to do this so both you and others can see it, a plaque with a gavel, and it bears the inscription to Don Frisbee for outstanding service as president from 1995 to 1996. Don, with our thanks. Thank you. You can't break it loose. You can't break it loose. And now to begin today's program. The program today is co-sponsored by the Oregon Ethics Commons, the Institute for Metropolitan Studies, and the Northwest Foundation of Ethics. We thank these organizations for helping to make this program possible. Our board host today is our new president-elect, Dr. Frances Storrs, who is a professor of dermatology at the Oregon Health Sciences University. She'll have the privilege of asking the first question, and then we'll open the mic to questions from the floor, from City Club members, and from members of our co-sponsoring organizations. So please line up behind the microphone, which is in the center of the room, even before Franz had a chance to complete her question, so that we can have an opportunity for Rabbi Lerner to answer as many questions as possible in the time allotted. Please identify yourself as a member of the club or as a member of one of the organizations, and please limit your questions to 30 seconds or less. Rabbi Michael Lerner holds 2 doctorate degrees in psychology and in philosophy. As a student Lerner quickly became involved in the social change movements of the 1960s at UC Berkeley as a member of the executive committee of the free speech movement, as the chairperson of Berkeley Students for a Democratic Society, and an activist involved in confrontation politics against the Vietnam War, as well as in favor of civil rights and the Black liberation movement. But in the 1970s, Dr. Lerner felt some estrangement from the New Left, as he put it, and I'm quoting, like so many macho men on the political right, and like so many of the militarists they were fighting against, many men on the left feared being identified as soft or mushy or, God forbid, feminine, as in paying attention to feelings or to being motivated by ethical or spiritual sensitivity. After completing his PhD, he went out and practiced psychology, doing family and individual counseling at a county health facility with middle-income clients and welfare recipients. Based on this work, Dr. Lerner wrote a book entitled Surplus Powerlessness, which was published by his Institute for Labor and Mental Health in 1986. In it, Lerner analyzed the psychodynamics of daily life, the psychological and social and intellectual sources of powerlessness, and detailed strategies for how individuals and social change movements could overcome that powerlessness and move forward to change society. One reviewer called that book the most significant contribution to social theory since Herbert Marcuse and Wilhelm Reich. Dr. Lerner has now launched a campaign for a politics of meaning, an attempt to get the liberal and the progressive thinkers in this nation to move beyond the categories of the past and to adopt a new paradigm about human nature, one that acknowledges the psychological, ethical, and spiritual dimensions of human reality. He's as often excoriated by the right as he is by the left because he does not fit into any neat category and he does not toe the party line. Let me give you just one example of that, and I do that indirectly also to advertise his book, which I have just finished reading, called The Politics of Meaning by Michael Lerner. And I need to let you know that Looking Glass Bookstore will have a number of these books available in the back of the room, which Rabbi Lerner has kindly agreed to stay and inscribe for those of you who would like to have him do that. And I'm quoting out of this book. In decrying President Clinton's early, and I'm quoting, capitulation to the military and conservatives in Congress, he suggested instead that a courageous president would have talked to his constituents like this, and I'm quoting, "I know it's going to take special courage for those in the military to deal with their fears about manhood. Underlying their panic at having homosexuals in the same room is their own doubts about whether they can sustain their manhood and whether they can keep under control their own desire to be more caring, more nurturing, more like a woman. It's not that they fear that they're really homosexuals. Most who oppose this ban certainly are not, but they fear whether they can stand the anxiety of being with men who might remind them of the part of themselves that has caused them so much pain to repress. I believe that this is the task not just for men in the military, but for all men in our society. And that's why I, as president, am going to stand strong, this is me as president of the United States, for my insistence that homosexuals really are nothing to be afraid of. They won't destroy anything, and we as a society are strong enough to allow their different way of being sexual without feeling that we'll be overtaken by it." End of quote. Can you imagine it? Wouldn't it be refreshing? And does this man have a future as a White House speechwriter? The Washington Post commented that Michael Lerner does not mince words, and they're worth quoting at length. His magazine, Tikkun, has published some of the most exciting writers, thinkers, novelists, and poets in the United States, and they've also been brought together in Tikkun conferences and in a recent town meeting, which was entitled Say No to Gingrich. And speaking of Gingrich, that reminds us of another one of Rabbi Lerner's nemeses, Rush Limbaugh, who has denounced his writing and attacked him personally, and yet characteristically, Lerner writes, "Even if one dislikes Rush Limbaugh, one cannot deny the basis of his appeal. Like so many other talk show hosts, Limbaugh embodies a kind of passionate life energy. It naturally attracts people as an alternative to the boring and deadly policy discourses offered by high-minded public radio or television commentators whose fascination with technocratic details is rarely matched by their psychological sensitivity or spiritual vision." I told you he was worth quoting. And so with these charitable words foremost in our minds, I thought we should leave you, Rabbi Lerner, with a small memento of your time with us, something that you can take with you always. It's a bumper sticker which says, "Rush is right." And we look forward to hearing from you.
Well, this is terrific. I never thought I'd hold this in my hand. But there have been many moments which I never thought I'd see. I'm delighted to be here, very honored to have this opportunity to talk to you. And as I said to Christine Olson before, I had one part of the biography that wasn't in there, I think, so she didn't know about it, was that I was indicted by another U.S. attorney back in 1971 for leading anti-war demonstrations. And at that time, J. Edgar Hoover said, Michael Lerner is one of the most dangerous criminals in America. Well, when I thought that was sort of equally bizarre as when after I started talking to the Clintons about the politics of meaning, the Washington Post had a huge story entitled "The Guru of the White House," supposedly me. It reminded me of these sort of misunderstandings and miscommunications of a story my father used to tell about a couple that was having a lot of trouble in their relationships, and at the end of, they were approaching their 20th anniversary, and the communication gap seemed to be growing more and more, and so the wife said to the husband, you know, I think that what we need is to go away from the context of our normal life, and let's have a month in a South Sea island where we can talk to each other and not be distracted by the work pressures upon us. And he said, well, it's going to be very hard to take that amount of time off from work. It's very, very difficult for me. On the other hand, I really care about the relationship. There has been a lot of struggle in this relationship. I'm going to do it. I'm going to ask for the time. I think we can do this. But just one thing, he said, pointing to the old woman on a rocking chair in the next room. Just once in our marriage, we're going someplace without taking your mother. And she said, my mother? I thought she was yours. So these communication gaps can be... So from the most dangerous criminal in America to the guru of the White House, and now the proclaimer of Russia's right, all in some bizarre way connected. I want to tell you a little bit about the work that I did as a psychotherapist that led me to develop the politics of meaning. For 10 years, I worked on a project with a bunch of fellow psychotherapists, social change activists, union activists, in which we were at the Institute for Labor and Mental Health in Oakland. And then the work involved running groups for 12 weeks with middle-income working people. And we focused in particular on why people were moving to the right in this country, why they were moving to the political right. And what we discovered was that many people were moving to the right because they were in deep pain. Over the course of those 10 years, we had in our groups over 5,000 middle-income working people. And what we learned was that the pain was very different than what we had expected. People talked to us about the situation that they faced in the world of work and the lack of opportunity to use their intelligence and their creativity in work. But what was most startling to us was the complaint that people had that there was very little opportunity for most people to use their intelligence and creativity to serve the common good, to do something that made sense with their lives. And so people were complaining about the lack of ethical and spiritual import in their lives. They felt that they were wasting their lives all day long serving the requisites of their boss or the requisites of the workplace, but never being able to use their intelligence to serve something that they actually believed in. Now, this was startling to us because coming from the liberal or progressive world, coming from academia and coming from the world of psychotherapy, we brought with us a set of elitist assumptions about America and about middle-income working people. And those elitist assumptions were that we, the people from academia, the people from the liberal culture, the people who had gone to universities, we had meaning needs. We cared about ethical and spiritual purpose, but they, the rest of the population, was only concerned about the bottom line. What they wanted was money and benefits. And so it was startling to hear so many people telling us that this was not the case, and not that people didn't want money, but that very often it was compensatory. That is, people were saying to us, we want that as a compensation for the fact that we're wasting our life all day long doing work that has no meaning and purpose to us, that its sole goal is to accumulate money or power for the institutions that we work for. And at the same time, these same people were telling us that they felt bad about themselves because they weren't doing better at learning what it takes to make it in that world. That is, the same people who hated this, a world in which the bottom line for their work world was accumulating wealth and power for those whom they worked, were simultaneously feeling like, well, that's reality. That is, and I have to accommodate to it even though I hate it. And so, and then feeling bad about themselves because they were not more successful at knowing how to operate in that world, seeing that the most successful people in that world were those who were best at manipulating and controlling other people, at getting other people to do what you wanted them to do, and then spending their weekends often trying to figure out, going to seminars to get better training in how to learn how to be more successful at manipulating others, to get them to do what you need them to do, and feeling that they were inadequate because they weren't good at that skill. Meanwhile, all day long, internalizing the ethos of the marketplace. And that ethos is an ethos that teaches us to forget the fundamental insights of religion, articulated, for example, in the Bible, that says human beings are created in the image of God and deserve to be treated as created in the image of God, as infinitely precious, as beings whom we should care about. And instead, learning how to see them from a market consciousness, namely, looking at people not from the standpoint of wonder at the miracle that is embodied in every human being, but rather looking at every human being from the standpoint of, what can I get from you? How will you advance my career? How will you make it possible for me to get my own needs met? And that consciousness becomes the consciousness that they had to realistically, that is to be realistic, to learn how to do, to learn how to incorporate if they were to be more successful in the world of work. And then recognizing that most of the people who are honored in the world of work, the people who become the great successes, the ones who then are honored by the community as the leaders of the corporate world, are those who are best at doing precisely that thing, and themselves feeling they've got to learn how to do it better. So all day long, learning to internalize the bottom line consciousness of the marketplace, which is maximize wealth and power, and learning simultaneously the notion that the common sense of daily life should be looking out for number one. And that was the title of the book that became the bestseller of the 1980s, and it became the bestseller precisely because people felt they didn't know how to do it well enough. And they needed to read this book in order to learn how to better look out for number one, because this was how the real world operates. Now, meanwhile, as people are learning this all day long, over and over again, and learning that every other person around them is doing the same thing, they bring that consciousness home into the rest of their lives, so that they then find themselves surrounded by a rip-off consciousness in the entire society. In the few hours that people live outside the world of work, they bring home what they have learned and the way to treat other people, the way that they think about other people. From the world of work, this market consciousness permeates the rest of the society, so that you get a rip-off consciousness that permeates the society from every economic level. From the very top, where some, not all by any means, but some corporate executives think it's perfectly appropriate to rip off the resources of the planet without regard to the future survivability of the Earth, because this is what they're there for. They're supposed to provide, maximize the wealth of their corporations, and if they don't, somebody else will put in their place. No judgment being made about individuals, because in fact they're correct about the perception of their own limited power in the corporate world, that somebody will replace them to do that very thing if they don't do it. But this rip-off consciousness then permeates the entire economic order, all the way down to some, not all, some small sector of poor people who think that it's perfectly appropriate to rip you off in your car or in your home or on the streets and so forth. In other words, throughout the society, a rip-off consciousness, a me first, take care of myself, look out for number one without regard to the consequences of others. And what happens in such a society is that people feel themselves surrounded by an ethos of selfishness. They feel that everyone, and people will tell this to you when you ask them about how it really feels to be in this society, they feel that they can't count on anybody, that everybody is just looking out for themselves. And this creates a monumental crisis in the society, because people feel lonely, And they feel that every exchange, even the most important connections, are based on market exchange. So that friendships, they report to us, used to be based on a certain degree of solidarity and commitment in which you recognize the other person not for what they could do for you, but because you felt a commitment to them. But that more and more as the market consciousness permeates relationships, people see it only as an equal exchange. What's the problem with an equal exchange? Well, when you're sick, when you're not so strong, when you can't give back equally, then you no longer have faith that the other person will be there for you because you can't give the equal exchange. And where this manifests, then, this is in an undermining of friendships. Now, similarly, when people try to teach their kids about values in the society, their kids turn on the television and see what the world is like, and they say to their parents or to their Sunday school teachers or their Hebrew school teachers, come on, don't tell us about values. We know what the society is really like. It has nothing to do with the values you're talking about. And so you get a real crisis in values in the society. And most importantly, in family life, in loving relationships, the market consciousness permeates loving relationships so that more and more people learn to see each other as commodities to be consumed rather than as beings to be responded to with appreciation, with awe, with wonder for the miracle that each of us is. Instead, we see each other in terms of what we can get from each other. And as that increasingly becomes the dominant form of human relationships, loving relationships become a market commodity. And people begin to ask about every person, well, is this one taste good? If not, I'll discard it. Like any other commodity, go on to the next one and the next one and the next one. And there is a way in which each person, when they make a commitment to another person, the more the market consciousness permeates, the more the commitment becomes the following. It becomes a statement of, well, given the available options, it seems to me that this person is most likely to meet more of my needs in the short run than anyone else. And therefore, I've made a market assessment of my possibilities, and I'm going to make a commitment based on a rational assessment of options available to me. You know what I'm talking about? You see, now, and this creates a tremendous fear even in the most fundamental relationships, most loving relationships, because the more this consciousness permeates the relationships, the more people feel insecure. They are never sure that their partner will not at some point in his or her life be able to cut a better deal. And if they can cut a better deal, then they come to me as a psychotherapist or now as a rabbi, and they say, look, I met somebody else who can satisfy more of my needs. Now, don't get me wrong, it's not that satisfying needs is irrelevant, but if that's all that a relationship is, if there is no capacity to see the other human being as embodying the Spirit of God, or if you're secular as being fundamentally deserving of respect and caring, of being treated as a subject and not an object in the language of Immanuel Kant, or as an end and not a means. If you can't see another human being that way, then market relationships creates this tremendous insecurity because you're never sure how strong, how much your partner will be there for you. And as a result, it's not just the 50% of relationships of marriages that end up in divorce that are insecure, 50% that end up in divorce, but also the other 50% that don't end up in divorce, but there's a tremendous insecurity there because people aren't sure that, as I say, that your partner won't be able to cut a better deal at some point in their life. Now, this creates a tremendous upset in the society, and the right came along and positioned itself as the articulator of the pain. It talked about the crisis in crime. It talked about the crisis in values. It talked about the crisis in family life and loving relationships, and the right was entirely correct about this. And in that sense, I can say Russia's right. There really is a crisis in the society about the ethical and spiritual dimension of human life in this society, and it is real. Now, the problem is that the right's analysis was disgusting and terrible and missed the boat. That is to say, the right correctly articulates the problem, but its analysis was the following. What it said was, oh yeah, there's this ethos of selfishness, and where does this come from? It turns to the demeaned others of the society, the traditional demeaned others, gays and lesbians, African Americans, Jews, feminists, immigrants, all the traditional demeaned others of the society, and it says that these people, aided and abetted by liberal big government, are pursuing their selfish interess, and because of that, we all have a crisis of ethics and of family life in the society. Now, I can tell you, for 20 years being a psychotherapist, actually more than 20 years a psychotherapist, that I've asked many other of my colleagues, I've never yet had anybody come to me and say that their problem in the relationship was that as they were trying to work it out, that there were gays and lesbians that were getting involved. That is not what's undermining loving relationships, folks. And not African Americans, and not welfare queens. They are not what's undermining loving relationships. What is undermining loving relationships is the ethos of selfishness that is generated by the market in this society and by the consciousness that people learn all day long in the world of work and in the economy. But the right, ironically, is the champion of the ethos of selfishness and materialism in the world of work. In the world of work, the right is totally opposed to the introduction of any categories of responsibility that would limit the individual or the corporation from pursuing its own self-interest without regard to the consequences for others. So here you have the right, the champion of selfishness in the world of work, and the articulator of the pain that that selfishness causes in personal life when it is brought home from work into personal life. How do they get away with this? Well, the way they get away with this is because the liberals and the progressive forces in the society are not even in the relevant ballpark. They do not have a clue as to what's going on in America. And this is a very sad fact, but it has to do with the analytic categories, the intellectual categories that are available to the left in this country, to the liberal forces, to the progressive forces. Because liberals understand economic needs, and they understand political rights needs, these two elements. And in those areas, when they were in the 1930s fighting for economic entitlements for people, they did a terrific job. And when in the 60s and 70s, they were rectifying the inequalities in the area of rights, both on the individual and group level, they did a terrific job. And I feel very proud to have come from the liberal and left forces of this society and to identify with their tremendous contribution, both in stopping the war in Vietnam and in fighting for women's equality, gay and lesbian rights, for the civil rights movement and so forth. But there is a tremendous inadequacy in their analysis because they do not have an understanding of the ethical and spiritual dimension of human needs. They do not understand this dimension of what it is to be a human being, and consequently, they conflate the two things, why people are moving to the right with the rights analysis. So what you hear from the liberal and progressive world very often is that people are moving to the right because they are racist, they are sexist, they are homophobic, or they are stupid. And this is not true. There may well be a core element of people on the right, and I understand you know some of them in Oregon, for whom what I've just said is true. But it is not the case that most people moving to the right, and I say moving, I don't mean the 10 or 15% of hardcore nutcases. I'm talking about the people who were voting for Johnson in 1964, who have moved to the right subsequently and made liberal and progressive politics relatively isolated in the society today. They are moving to the right for legitimate reasons, even though the right's analysis is incorrect because nobody else is speaking to those needs. And that's why we decided to create Tikkun magazine, T-I-K-K-U-N. It means, it's a Hebrew word, it means to heal, repair, and transform the world. It started as a Jewish magazine, although now many of our readers are not Jewish, and to then set up the foundation for ethics and meaning and begin a national campaign for a politics of meaning. Because what we need is within a liberal and progressive framework, a way of addressing these needs, and that means a reformulation of what politics is about, and a deeper understanding of what human needs are that I don't think we can do within the context of the liberal and progressive world, and that's why we started a different kind of politics that transcends left and right. The fundamental analysis of what a politics of meaning is about is this. It is about attempting to challenge the bottom line consciousness of the society and arguing that the bottom line should not be selfishness and materialism, it should be love and caring, or to make it more technical, to change the definition of efficiency and productivity from a definition that says an institution is efficient or productive to the extent that it tends to maximize wealth and power, to a definition that says that, that productivity and efficiency must also include the degree to which an institution tends to create loving and caring human beings who are capable of ethical, spiritual, and ecological sensitivity. Now, this is a big change, okay? And I wouldn't blame you if at this point you're saying, was this guy a nutcase? What, you know, does he really think that this is possible? After all, human beings have for so long been motivated by selfishness and materialism. And I want to say two things about that. The first thing is that as dramatic a change of what I'm talking about is, it's no more dramatic than what happened 30 years ago when women came forward and said, we want to challenge patriarchy in this society. We want to challenge the oppression of women. And so many people got up at that point and said, including women, saying, come on, the whole history of the human race, women have never had equality in the bedroom, in the kitchen, or in the workplace. How could you possibly expect to change this? Isn't it human nature to be that way? Luckily, most women did not accept that analysis. They refused to be, quote, logical in that sense, and instead said, forget about what has been, let's focus on what we need in order to respect and take seriously the way in which we are created in the image of God. And as a result, the most important revolution of the 20th century has taken place in the past 30 years as women have insisted that their spirit of God in them be taken seriously and have made dramatic changes in the society, far beyond anything that we could have conceptualized at the time that they came forward, and certainly far beyond anything that the skeptics could have imagined when they asked people to be realistic. Thank God that they weren't realistic. It is in that same sense that I'm saying to you today that we need a new kind of politics in the society, a politics that is not realistic in the way that liberals and the Democratic Party has been realistic, namely by redefining its politics to move further and further to the right, assuming that if they could position themselves as born-again rightists, they would ultimately succeed. Well, they may retain power. If that's the name of the game and what you want is power, you may be able to retain power. But if you may retain power in the way that Eisenhower retained power in 1956. His reelection, Eisenhower's reelection in 1956, was the ultimate victory of the New Deal because he was elected as a Republican, adopting the positions of the Democratic Party, of the New Deal. That is what is happening in 1996, once again, when we see the Clintons and many people in Congress repositioning themselves with a content of politics that is so close to what George Bush would have said in 1989 that it's virtually indistinguishable on many, 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 many points. So we've seen this shift moving as people have become realistic. They've actually not been realistic. They have accommodated to a discourse that moves further and further to the right. The only alternative to that is to have an alternative vision, a different vision of what politics should be about. And I submit to you today that that different vision cannot be about a new economic entitlement or a set of new economic entitlements, a new attempt to redefine the New Deal, or a new set of political rights. It has to speak to a deeper and truer level of human reality. The right has spoken, I believe in a distorted way, but nevertheless speaks to the real crisis in the ethical and spiritual life of our society. A progressive politics that is to be successful has to speak in that same way. And if it does, then it comes forward with a whole new definition of what is oppression. It has to reject the narrow forms of oppression that said that you're only oppressed if you're economically oppressed or if you're denied your rights. It has to look to middle-income people and acknowledge that many middle-income people are in pain. Up till now, what we've said to those people is, you're in pain, go to psychotherapy. It's your own individual problem. And what I'm saying to you is, no, it is not their own individual problem. The right recognizes that. It recognizes that there's a social reality going on here when you have 50% divorce rate and so on. There is a social reality. It is a social problem, and we have to have a social analysis of the ethical and spiritual crisis. And that's what a politics of meaning is about. Now, I've only begun to talk to you about it. We're doing a summit this weekend about it. The book tries to lay out in much more detail some of the concretes of what a politics of meaning would be. But frankly, we're at the beginning stages of building a whole new politics. And I'm here to invite you to join with us, because trying to work out what a politics based on love and caring would actually be. That is to take the spiritual values, the deepest truths of our biblical tradition, and to bring them into the rest of our lives, into the Monday through Friday, not just to keep them in church on Sunday or in synagogue on Saturday, but to bring them into the rest of our lives, to figure out what an economic institution would look like that really took seriously that idea, to figure out what our schools would look like, what our hospitals would look like, what all the social institutions of the society would look like. I can begin that process, but I need you and your smarts and your contribution to figure it out in detail, how to build a different kind of world. This is a new paradigm. It is not an attempt to refashion liberal politics. It is a transcendence of left and right. And I'm very honored to be here to share this with you and to urge you to join with me and with thousands of other people who are now moving towards saying, yes, this is the moment to implement our highest vision, to go for the highest part of ourselves, and to give up on the attempts to be realistic that have ended up being self-defeating. Thank you.
Dr. Frances Storrs, our president-elect, will ask the first question, but I will also invite you, as she is doing that, to please approach the mic with questions of your own.
Well, clearly the only appropriate response to Rabbi Lerner's remarks is hallelujah, and I know I echo feelings of many of you in saying that. I have a reputation for speaking rapidly, and I have a lot to learn. I actually have about 5 questions I'd like to ask him, and if I use some of his techniques, I think I could probably get them all in 30 seconds. But the question I will ask him has to do with taking some of these global issues and bringing them into our personal lives, and maybe I ask him as a counselor to help us as individuals to use any means that he has found that are effective, or any strategies that he's found that have actually worked in encountering individuals that we meet day to day in our lives, whom rightly or wrongly we believe may be acting in a greedy sort of fashion. And what can we do as individuals that will help convince these people that a return to the public good and to efforts directed to the public good can be as thrilling for them as their pursuit of greed is?
It's a great question. I have 2 levels. One is that at every level, when you hear people say, oh, come on, be realistic, everybody's just out for themselves, to stop them and to say, wait a second, it's not true about me, and I don't really think it's true about you. And to engage people seriously in that about self-reflection because I don't think it is true of most people. But what is true, and this is why it's more complex, is that most of us are caught between a part of ourselves that wants to go for our highest ethical and spiritual vision, and a part of ourselves that thinks that this is totally unrealistic and that we're going to get screwed if we do this. That somebody else will take advantage of us while we are going for our idealistic part. And so both of these things are in constant tension, and in every interaction, every moment in our lives, we are constantly making assessments of how much can I go for the part of me that I hold most dear versus how much do I have to protect myself on the assumption that you are going to act according to the market requisites. And as I make that assessment, a critical part of that assessment is my assessment of what is happening in the totality of the society. So what is likely to be your response? So that in the 1930s, when there was the Depression, people felt more, there was a movement there, the New Deal, that made people feel that they could go more for their spiritual or idealistic part. In the 1940s, when the Second World War was there, more people felt they could give of themselves without being made foolish. Similarly, in the 1960s, when there were social movements, more people acted from that part of themselves, which is their highest self. Today, in the 1990s, the only occasions that people have to do this tend to be earthquakes, floods, natural disasters, because at such moments, people are not afraid that they will be ridiculed for going for their highest part. You see, so in other words, their assessment of the totality allows people at that moment when there's a flood or a natural disaster to say, fine, now I can pour out of my house and help other people without just watching out for myself. And people look back on these natural disasters. When we have some now evidence of people being interviewed who've been participating and saying this was the greatest part of my life with those natural disasters because there was a spirit of community and connectedness. So what's possible at any moment is reflected by the totality. In that sense, I'm slightly challenging the question in this way, that it's not really possible for us to just do this without a social movement. There needs, just as in the women's movement, when at the very beginning, some women said, well, can I go and just challenge my husband or challenge my boyfriend or challenge my boss? And the answer was no. You couldn't do that without the weight of a women's movement behind you. When there was a women's movement, then each individual woman was facing every interaction with the weight that both she knew and the boss or the husband or the boyfriend knew, that there were millions of people saying the same thing. So she wasn't isolated and alone. That's what we need for trying to transform the fundamental ethos of this society. We need there to be not just people in this room who clap and then go home, but to actually join with us and create a political movement for a politics of meaning. In doing that, each person then becomes much stronger and empowered to challenge the ethos of selfishness wherever she or he finds it.
Hello, I'm Barbara Clark. I'm a City Club member and also currently the president of the Oregon Ethics Commons. And some of you may be wondering, is it too late to sign up for the summit on the weekend? And the answer is no, it is not. We have an 800 number for anybody who's interested. It's 1-800-771-4205. And would you like to say a little bit more about what a person could expect in this further development on the weekend?
Well, both in the weekend and in the organization, we're going to be talking about how you actually start to do this. One of the things we did at the National Summit of Ethics and Meaning that took place in Washington, April 14th to 16th, we had 1,800 people, including the national president of the AFL-CIO, leaders of the major Christian denominations. This is not just a side little thing. There is a lot of movement in this direction today. There's a lot of people, and what we did was we got people together in professions, and we began to have discussions, and we want to see if we can create this in Portland as well. Discussions with doctors, with lawyers, with people who are teachers, with social workers, people who are union activists, in a whole variety of different spheres, and asking people to come together to talk about what would it look like in your profession if you just allowed yourself to fantasize what that world would be like if the new bottom line was love and caring and ethical and spiritual sensitivity. And the only rule is don't have somebody there saying, no, we can't do this. Well, we had 50 lawyers engaged in this conversation, okay? Now, and I want to say that it was fantastic that people came up with some really exciting ideas about ways in which they would want to change the law once they were allowed themselves to think themselves into this framework. So that's one of the things we'll be doing in the weekend, is doing that kind of thing. We'll also be talking about specific platform planks, what a politics of meaning would look like concretely in a whole variety of policy areas, and we'll also be going deeper into these ideas and figuring out ways to build ongoing study groups, consciousness-raising groups. The women's movement built itself primarily on consciousness-raising groups, and the first thing that we're asking everybody here is take the book, invite a few friends, and sit with it. Come together once every 2 weeks and read a chapter and talk about how your life would be different if these ideas were implemented. You don't have to agree that from the start that it's possible. Just allow yourself to think yourself into a world in which it would be possible, and from there, you'll see how empowering that could be.
Hi, I'm Marcia Spellman, a member of the City Club. This morning on NPR, there was Bob Dole speaking about his new tax plan, which would then give another tax cut, and all the middle-class people in this country would have more money in their pockets. And it just seemed to me, as I was listening to it, that it is the issue is that of greed, and if we have more money, it's a pretty uniting force on that side of the politics. On the other side of the political scale, the progressive or liberal or whatever, we have so many different groups of people. We have people who have very different issues. We have people whose issues sometimes are almost repulsive to other people on that same side of the coin. My question to you is, with the fragmentation of the liberal or the left, it seems really easy on the right, more money and them against us. But the us on this side is not a united us. It's a very fragmented and sometimes bitter. How do we sort of heal that and move together as a group?
Well, part of that has happened from a form of multiculturalism that we don't accept, namely one which talks about the ways in which each group is fundamentally different and has a kind of non-commensurable discourse with other groups. And we're focusing on what people have in common. We want to affirm people's identity, but also affirm the ways in which that identity, their uniqueness, is a window into the commonality of being created in the image of God. And the first part of your question, I think, is very, very important, and that is about tax cuts and selfishness. If you'll recall, after Clinton was elected, and he said straight out to me, he was using the stuff from the Politics of Meaning from Tikkun. He wrote me in 1988 saying that he had loved our analysis of why Dukakis lost. He thought we had the best analysis of American politics, and he was using those themes, almost sometimes quoting straight out of the editorials during the campaign. And right after, in the beginning of his presidency, he articulated the idea that this was going to be a time to overcome the selfishness and materialism of the Bush and Reagan years. And at that point, there was a huge surge in his popularity. And if you follow the polls in the first 2 or 3 months of his presidency, when he was still connected to that, the majority of Americans said, yes, I will pay higher taxes, and yes, I will pay higher amounts for my health care. But as Clinton himself withdrew from that and began to abandon one a campaign promise after another and justify that in terms of his own self-interest. That is, the people around him were saying, well, look, we've been reading the polls and it's not popular and so forth for him to take this stand on Bosnia or this stand on China or this stand on gays in the military and so forth. He was saying, my self-interest forces me to abandon my ideals. Now understand the dynamic of what's going on. When people believe there is a community of people willing to go for our highest ideals, we are willing to make sacrifices. We are excited about that possibility, and we are excited about the people who will lead us in that direction. But when the very leader of that campaign to abandon selfishness becomes himself projecting why he has to abandon his promises for the sake of his own self-interest, the guy who was going to lead us away from the self-interest of the Reagan-Bush years, then people begin to feel like, uh-oh, I've once again allowed myself to be fooled or tricked, and I don't want this. And then people immediately move in the opposite direction to say, there is no we. And if there is no we, then I have to look out for for me, for myself, for me alone. And it is this continual tension in people. It is not true that people are selfish. What's true is that we are split, all of us, between a part of us that is scared and feels that nobody will be there for us and hence we must just look out for ourselves, and a part of us that believes that we want to be in a world, a very different kind of world in which we are there together. And so our political leaders give us a sense of what the nature of the world is. And if they give us the nature of the world as them looking out just for themselves, then all the more we all feel like, well, there's nothing else in town. There is no other game in town, so of course I'd better just go for myself. That's why it's so important to create a politics of meaning movement as a visible thing, because that gives each of us the strength to feel that we can go for our highest ideals. And it's not just the people in this room. There are tens of millions of people in America who want that. They already act out of volunteerism. They do things in their personal lives that show they care about other people. They are not fundamentally selfish. It is not true of the others, of the American people, that they are fundamentally selfish. What is true is the same thing that's true about every single one of us, that there is this part of us that's scared and doesn't believe it's possible, and a part of us that wants to go for our highest ideals. And we have to create a context in which it's safe to go for our highest ideals.
Excuse me, I just need to say this, given the time, will have to be our last question.
Marie Morgan, City Club member. I was delighted to see the extensive coverage in our local daily last Sunday on this issue. I was a bit regretful to see that they cast it as the revival of the religious left. You said something about our need to shift the way we think and the way we actually perceive the world. Could you elaborate some more on how we respond to people we meet when they continue to see polarities, see old mental models, see the old boxes?
Right. Well, one thing that I think is very important, and I said it implicitly, I want to say it explicitly. We are not an attempt to counter Rush Limbaugh by doing what the people on some people on the right do, which is to demean other people. We don't want to do that. And I want to say that there are many, many, many people who disagree with me fundamentally and who will continue to poke fun or say that I'm a new age guru of the president or whatever, whom I still want to see their fundamental humanity and their fundamental way in which people are created in the image of God. And I think that a politics that we put forward, a politics of meaning, has to be one which understands that people who fundamentally disagree with us still embody the Spirit of God and must be treated and talked to in that way. So that's point A. Point B is I don't consider this the religious left because I'm very critical of the left, even though I come from the left. I'm critical of that part of the left that has been unable to assimilate these deeper ethical and spiritual issues and has been unable to articulate and talk about these issues. And that's why I don't call this a left movement. I say it is an attempt to transcend that. Very proud of what the left has contributed and very still identified with the struggle for economic justice and for political rights and against homophobia and against the attacks on African Americans and so forth. But still saying no, very often I've seen the religious left being a left that simply gives a quote from the Bible to the left agenda, or the liberal agenda. I'm saying the liberal agenda is wonderful but fundamentally inadequate because it focuses just on those who have been most economically oppressed or political rights oppressed. And we have to shift our agenda now to build a cross-class alliance, and the way to do that is to talk about the real pain of middle-income people. And if we can talk about the real pain of middle-income people, we will have a lot more to deliver to poor people and to the most oppressed. Right now, people who just talk about poor people and the most oppressed end up having nothing to deliver because they've managed to push away everybody else in the society. So on a personal level, we need to treat people with love and respect. On a political level, we need to take seriously the pain of middle-income people and not allow that to be denigrated or put as second place, because huge numbers of people are in pain in the society, and if we don't provide an alternative in a liberal and progressive framework, they will move further and further to the right that speaks to those same pains in a distorted way. Thank you.
Well, I told you he was worth quoting, if you can possibly manage it. Again, we are thrilled that you could join us today. We wish you success in the summit this weekend, and I'll remind you that Rabbi Lerner has agreed to stay and sign copies of his books after today, and I'd ask you to not forget your bumper sticker.